Chapter 5. A hand touched Holly's shoulder and gently shook it. "It's time," said Mrs. Figg softly. For a moment, Holly thought she was back at Hogwarts with Mrs. Figg, the caretaker, waking her because she had fallen asleep in some inappropriate place. Then the memories came rushing back. Vernon, Dad, the house, polkas, boots. Holly rubbed the sleep from her eyes and sat up. Feeling around in the dark, Holly found her shoes and hastily put them on. Mrs. Figg waited quietly while Holly pulled the sweatshirt over her head and straightened out her braids. Then she put a spoon and a bowl of cabbage soup in Holly's hand. Holly ate automatically, not yet awake enough to be hungry. Though cold, the soup tasted fairly spicy, no doubt due to all that mustard added the previous day. "Ready?" asked Mrs. Figg after Holly had visited the loo and splashed some water on her face. "I guess so," replied Holly uncertainly, while lifting the already packed bag and placing its strap over her shoulder. "Then I'd best be getting the cats," said Mrs. Figg, turning towards the door. "Good-bye, dear, and good luck." "Good-bye," said Holly. Impulsively she caught Mrs. Figg's hand, holding her back. "Thank you," she whispered, giving Mrs. Figg a tight hug. "No problem, dear," replied Mrs. Figg, hugging her back. Holly hugged Mrs. Figg again, afraid to let go. About to leave the shelter of the house, Holly suddenly felt alone and scared. "Everything's going to be okay," Mrs. Figg assured Holly, sensing her fear and uncertainty. She stepped back from Holly and looked in her eyes. "Remember," Mrs. Figg added confidently, "if he didn't think you could do it, he wouldn't have asked." Holly could barely see the outline of Mrs. Figg's face, but her words and emotions could easily be heard and felt. They gave Holly the confidence to face the unknown outside. "You'd better fetch the cats now," Holly said, looking down to hide the tears in her eyes. She was scared, but resolved to go forward. How could she be any less brave than Mrs. Figg, who had lived over 20 years in this nightmare world? Mrs. Figg nodded and walked towards the door. When Mrs. Figg's back was turned, Holly carefully drew out the invisibility cloak and threw it over her head. By unspoken agreement, Mrs. Figg would neither see the method Holly used to leave unobserved, nor would she actually see Holly leave the house. That way, Mrs. Figg could be honestly unable to relate this information to anyone else, if asked. Mrs. Figg unlatched the numerous locks and opened the door. She stepped outside, leaving the door open behind her. "Boots," she called. "Tiger, Poopsie, Prince, Snowball, time to come in now." Daylight had scarcely begun. Holly slipped out silently behind Mrs. Figg through the open door. The world was mostly gray and dark outside. Holly watched her feet and the ground carefully as she cautiously moved forward to make sure she didn't trip or stumble. Mrs. Figg stepped off the paved pathway and onto the lawn. "Here, kitty, kitty," she called. "Breakfast." Holly tiptoed down the empty pathway. She reached the edge of the yard and turned onto the sidewalk in the direction of the main part of the town. "Come on, kiddies, where are you?" shouted Mrs. Figg. Her voice covered any sounds Holly might make while passing. Holly continued walking without looking back, stopping briefly when she noted some silent shapes gliding forward. The cats. They had been keeping watch and were returning, now that Holly was safely away from the house. Holly longed to ask one of the cats to come along, to keep her company, but didn't. They would connect her with Mrs. Figg, and from Mrs. Figg to the house that had mysteriously disappeared. That was too risky. So Holly walked on alone, while hidden beneath her cloak. Slowly the grays and white of dawn brightened into regular colors. Holly continued walking towards the center of town. She watched the street signs carefully, hoping that the street names, and in particular the location of the bus station, had not changed in 20 years. She didn't remember much of Little Winging when the family had driven here. Was that only yesterday? But it didn't look all that different from the other towns Holly had visited. The private residences gradually vanished. More and more of the buildings contained stores and businesses. Holly noted the usual trash and grime one would expect along the streets. She easily avoided the occasional people of various ages that also walked or jogged on the sidewalks in the early morning. The few cars and bicycles on the roads gradually increased in numbers as the day progressed. Suddenly, something swooped overhead, missing Holly by inches. Holly looked on in amazement as something that looked like a cross between a motorcycle and a broomstick flew out of sight. It was totally black, as was the figure riding it. No one paid any particular attention to it. Some movement caught the corner of Holly's eye, and she ducked in time, being narrowly missed by a second black broom combo. This time Holly got a better glimpse as it passed. There was a bright red S emblazoned on the side of the vehicle. The rider wore a red armband with a black S on it. That must be the security Mrs. Figg spoke of. Nearly silent in flight, the security people did not confine their travel to the streets, and wove confidently in and out between the pedestrians on the sidewalk. Holly decided it might be safer to be seen than risk being crashed into by a security vehicle whose rider was unaware of her presence. Accordingly, she stepped into a quiet, unoccupied alley. Looking carefully about to make sure no one was near, Holly moved behind a dumpster and removed her invisibility cloak. Immediately, Holly felt the emotions of the people on the street. The invisibility cloak had blocked such things for her before. Holly mentally double-checked that she was alone before carefully folding and tucking her cloak securely under her shirt. Feeling very exposed and vulnerable, Holly cautiously stepped back on the main sidewalk. Would the other people out there notice? Would they realize she was a stranger and different? But Holly didn't sense any emotions of surprise or interest at her presence. While Holly stood still, surveying the situation, the walking people continued on their way, moving neatly around her without breaking their stride. Taking a step of her own, Holly hesitantly joined the rest of the pedestrians. Intent on his or her own affairs, no one seemed to pay any particular attention to Holly. With every step, Holly felt more confident. For now, at least, Holly seemed to blend in with the crowd. When a third black broom and a security person swooped past, weaving around Holly along with the other people, Holly breathed a huge sigh of relief. Mrs. Figg's disguise was definitely working. Holly picked up her pace. She still had the bus station to find. An hour later, Holly spotted a large bus sign hanging over a set of double doors. She stood outside across the street from it for a while, just observing. People came in and out without hesitation. No one seemed to be guarding the door or watching things. It looked safe enough. Readjusting her shoulder strap, Holly carefully crossed the street. She walked up to the entrance, took a deep breath, and opened the door. A ticket counter was placed prominently across from the door. A uniformed man sat at the counter looking and feeling rather bored. Large bulletin boards stood on either side of the counter with all sorts of schedules posted. Checking the clock on the wall, Holly walked forward and carefully studied the schedules. When she was ready, she stood in line behind two other people and waited her turn. "May I help you?" asked the man selling tickets when Holly reached the front of the line. "Yes," said Holly, placing most of her meager supply of money on the counter. "I would like 2 tickets to Thorpe, please." Thorpe was not Holly's actual destination, but it passed through Egham, and Egham had a train station with trains that ran to London. Holly intended to get off at Egham. Mrs. Figg made Holly promise to not give away her actual destination at the train station. "They have eyes everywhere," she insisted. Holly thought it a waste of money to purchase 2 tickets, but Mrs. Figg insisted otherwise. She assured Holly that she was too young to be traveling alone. A single ticket would attract unwanted attention upon Holly. Buying 2 tickets would imply a traveling companion. For a while, Holly considered just using her cloak and sneaking onto the bus, but decided things would be too cramped. A passenger trying to sit down on what appeared to be an empty seat, bumping into someone that wasn't there, it would be too easy to get discovered. Far better to use the cloak while on the train, where there would be more places to keep out of the way. As it was, the ticket man raised an eyebrow at Holly when he saw she stood alone in the line. Holly noticed his glance. My mum's in the loo," she stated softly, answering his unspoken question. "She wasn't feeling too well." He nodded briefly and placed 2 tickets and her change on the counter. "Platform C," he informed her. "It will be leaving in about 40 minutes. "Thank you," said Holly, looking again at the clock on the wall and noting the time. She reached out with her hands, getting both the tickets and change, and hastily shoved it all in a slim compartment in her bag, zipping it up afterwards. Then she moved away from the counter and went to the parking area and back to find Platform C. There were 5 platforms. The air smelled heavily of exhaust fumes. Gray grime coated the walls and floor. Despite the usual trash cans placed at strategic locations, bits of trash and garbage were scattered all around. A bus was leaving Platform A, and another was pulling into Platform D. People were getting off the third bus at Platform E. There was no bus in front of Platform C. Holly sat down at the bench across from her platform. She pulled out an apple from her bag and began to eat it while looking around. People intent on catching their desired buses passed swiftly on either side, paying no attention to her. They carried an assortment of bags and briefcases, reassuring Holly that her own small bag would not seem out of place. A huge poster on one wall showed a young, handsome, proud-looking man wearing a tailored all-black uniform with red trim. He stood against a collage backdrop showing a tearful mother and child, an exploding building, a vicious-looking man wearing a mask entering a window, and an exploding airplane. The caption said, "Security protects us all." Security, mused Holly, studying the person on the poster. Was that how Polkus looked? Holly noted a sign indicating the location of the public bathrooms. On one of the walls next to it was a public pay telephone. On the opposite wall was a sturdy-looking black door marked with a prominent red S. Even firmly closed, it looked ominous somehow. It could be imagination, but Holly thought the S looked suspiciously like a snake. When she finished her apple, Holly pulled out her jar of water and took a long drink before replacing it back in her bag. Then she got up and walked to a garbage bin. She threw away the apple core and took the opportunity to visit the WC. Noting she still had some time when she got out, Holly moved casually over to the telephone. Fishing out some coins, she placed one in the slot and dialed the operator. "I'd like the number of a Mr. Charles Smith," she told the operator. "They live in Brundon, outside of Sudbury, Suffolk," she added. "I'm sorry," the operator told her after a moment, "but there are no Smiths living in Sudbury." "None?" whispered Holly in shock. "None," confirmed the operator confidently. "Would you like me to check another town?" "No, thank you," replied Holly, hanging up the telephone. She returned thoughtfully to her bench and sat down. Becky had lots of relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins. They all lived in and around Sudbury and, according to Becky, had done so for years, generations. They would have never moved. What could have happened to them all? "You would not be at the school if you were a filthy little mudblood. You and your muggle family would be rotting away in Azkaban prison where you belong." Unbidden, the words Tom Richards had said to her 2 years ago, the Tom Richards of this world, came to mind. They hadn't meant much at the time, as Holly didn't yet know about the time reverse curse. But now, Holly felt cold all over. She suddenly didn't want to know what happened to the Smiths, was afraid she already knew. Holly buried her head in her hands and wept soundlessly for the friend she didn't have. Then Holly thought of her parents and of Vernon, who had spent the night tied to a chair with no food, and cried some more. She had to get to Hogwarts and fix this. She just had to. A bus pulled up to Platform C and parked. The engine shut down. Its doors opened and several passengers stepped out. Other people lined up on one side waiting for their turn to get on. Holly sniffed a couple of times, used her sleeve to wipe the tears off her face, and pushed the stray strands of hair out of her face. Then she pulled out a ticket, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and stood to join the line. Finally, it was her turn to board the bus. The bus driver barely gave Holly a glance when she handed him her ticket. He moved his eyes swiftly to the ticket of the next passenger boarding. Relieved, Holly moved down the narrow aisle, found an empty seat near a window, and sat down. She placed her bag on her lap, leaned back, and closed her eyes. Now, all she had to do was keep track of the stops and get out at Egham. The time to leave drew near. The bus driver started the engine, letting it warm up. As she sat waiting for the bus to leave, the atmosphere of the people on the bus suddenly changed to one of apprehension. Holly looked up and out her window, seeking the cause. She saw 2 men dressed in black walking through the crowds below. Both wore stiff black hats and shiny black boots. The black hats had a blood-red oval in the center with a black S imprinted on them. Each man wore a crimson armband with a black S on it. Their uniforms were trimmed with matching red piping on the collars and cuffs. Security. The man in front was fairly tall with short yellow hair. The man behind him was a bit shorter and a bit heavier. He had short black hair and a small black mustache. Both men strode purposefully towards the platform. People backed quickly out of their way as they walked. Quickly, Holly reviewed her own activities. Had she done anything wrong? Had she aroused anyone's suspicions? No. Holly had spent the whole time unblocked. She would have known had someone become suspicious of her for whatever reason. The security men stopped in front of Holly's bus. Without speaking a word and without hesitation, the taller, blond-haired man entered the bus while the other man stood guard at the doors. This was clearly a practice maneuver. Unlike everyone else, Holly had never seen the security men in action and did not know what to expect. Like the rest of the passengers, however, Holly wondered fearfully why they had come. The man strode silently past the bus driver and began slowly walking down the aisle. He was confident, arrogant, proud, and very scary. A Slytherin all the way. The man carefully scrutinized each seated passenger. He was looking for someone. Then his glance fell upon Holly. Satisfaction filled his very being. Holly froze. He had found the person he was looking for, and knew it. The man moved forward confidently, stopping in front of Holly's seat. "You!" he demanded in a loud, angry voice. "Where are your travel papers?" "What?" squeaked Holly, looking at the man in surprise. His cold blue eyes bored straight through her. Nobody else had been asked to produce travel papers. Why had he singled her out? She sputtered, not knowing how to answer. The man did not wait for an answer. He hadn't been expecting one. Instead, he reached over and gripped Holly firmly under her armpit, lifting her up. Holly's bag slid from her lap. Almost by reflex, she grabbed it as the man pulled her out of the seat. "Come along with me," he growled. "You're in violation of Security Code 6703 of the traveling regulations." Holly could tell immediately that there was no code 6703, but the other passengers clearly did not. "He's lying," Holly protested, but the other passengers merely watched. They had all begun to relax when he started talking to Holly. "Ow!" exclaimed Holly as he dragged her into the aisle. "You're hurting me!" The man ignored her cries and continued to pull Holly by the arm down the aisle to the door. Holly squirmed and twisted, mostly in pain. But the man refused to relax his grip, and she was unable to break free. Immense relief filled the other passengers as she passed. There was also a smattering of pity, but no one lifted a hand to stop the man or help her. The two reached the front, and the man literally dragged Holly down the stairs and out of the bus. The second security man was waiting below for them. Without permitting Holly to regain her footing, he snatched her bag from her and grabbed Holly tightly under her armpit, lifting her nearly off her feet. The first man let go and moved behind Holly. Placing his hand on her shoulder, he gripped it tightly, preventing Holly from ducking or breaking away. Then he used his other hand to grab her opposite wrist. He jerked Holly's arm back, twisting the wrist painfully as he pulled, bending her arm behind her. "Come along," he told her coldly. Then he twisted Holly's arm up and back while pushing her ahead. Holly gasped in pain as she stumbled forward. The man gave Holly no opportunity to catch her breath or speak. Her arm felt like it would break any minute if she didn't keep moving in the desired direction. Without another word, he then proceeded to force Holly off the platform. The other man followed behind with her bag. Holly couldn't think clearly because of the pain. The hands that dug into her arm and shoulder dug even deeper when she struggled, increasing her pain. The security men didn't slow or stop their pace. At one point, Holly lost her footing, and he immediately jerked her up and dragged her along. They headed swiftly towards the black door. People quickly stepped out of their way as they moved. When the trio reached the wall, the black door opened. Hot steam hissed out, obscuring the interior. The man twisted Holly's arms up even higher, causing her to cry out in pain, and propelled her into the room. The second man followed. When all three were well inside, the door closed silently behind them. The steam vanished immediately, revealing a small, bare, windowless room, more like a cubicle lit by a single flaming torch stuck in the ceiling. A huge black calligraphy-style V decorated each of the 4 blood-red walls. But Holly noticed none of that. As soon as the door had closed, the blond man released his hold and pushed Holly violently forward, causing her to slam into the wall. Holly's head smashed against the hard surface with a loud thunk, and she slid to the floor. "Where's your wand?" he demanded. Her head pounded. Too stunned to move, Holly said nothing. "Answer me now! Answer me, you lousy non!" he shouted. "Crucio!" Holly screamed. The pain was excruciating. She had known it was coming, but there had been no place to dodge. Hot needles of fire pierced every nerve in her body. In her agony, Holly curled into a tight ball. Then it stopped. Through a haze of receding pain, Holly saw the blond man's face as he knelt down close to her, his own wand pointing threateningly at her eyes. "Shall we try again?" he questioned softly. "Where is your wand?" "I don't have a wand," Holly managed to gasp. The man frowned. "That is not the answer I wanted to hear," he said gently. He was not upset. He was in total control. "No!" Holly screeched desperately, sensing he was getting ready to cast another curse. "I had one," she admitted, "but I lost it just yesterday, I swear." That was true enough. "Please," Holly entreated, not wanting a repeat of the Cruciatus curse. The man stood up disgustedly. "We shall see if you're lying soon enough," he said, stepping back. "Scan her, Higgs," he directed the other man. The man tossed Holly's bag onto the floor next to her. Holly heard the distinctive clunk of breaking glass just before she felt her whole body go rigid from some sort of spell. It lasted but a moment, and then her limbs went limp. Holly moved a finger experimentally to see if it still worked. It rose slowly up and down at her command. "She's clean, sir," pronounced Higgs, "and so's her bag." "Well," said the blond man, stepping forward again, casually knocking Holly's bag aside with his foot, "at least you weren't lying about that." He knelt down again to study Holly. "But it's a crime to lose or misplace your wand, and I don't think you're that dumb. So, where is it?" "Sir," broke in Higgs significantly. Both Holly and the man looked at Higgs. Higgs was gazing with concern at the puddle of liquid spreading out on the floor. It had already pooled around one of the man's boots and was flowing steadily towards the other. With it came the odor of mustard and cabbage. The blond man stood quickly and removed his foot from the puddle, shaking off the excess drops of liquid. "What kind of potion is that?" he inquired with disgust, stepping well away from Holly and the suspicious liquid. "It isn't a potion," replied Holly, looking up at him. "It was my lunch." "Another likely story," he replied in disbelief. Stepping carefully around the puddle, the man returned to Holly. He bent down and grabbed her upper arm tightly. Suddenly everything went black. Holly felt like she was being pressed very hard from all directions. She couldn't breathe. Iron bands seemed to tighten around her chest. Her eyeballs were being forced back into her head. Her eardrums were being pushed deeper into her skull. And then Holly was breathing again. She felt as if she had just been squeezed into a garden hose. A loud crack sounded in her ear. When Holly's vision cleared, she found she was alone in the room. Her bag was gone, and a single bench rested in the middle of the room next to her. Holly remained huddled on the floor where the blond officer had left her. How had everything gone so completely and horribly wrong? It all happened so fast. 1 minute Holly had been relaxing on the bus, counting the minutes to Egham, and the next she had been dragged off the platform while her bus drove away. How had they recognized her so quickly? What had she done wrong? How did they know? What did they know? They hadn't known everything, she reflected. The officer had called her a non. Holly was a Hufflepuff, not a non. She knew Hufflepuffs did not exist in this world, only Slytherins and nons. What would they do to her if they learned she wasn't of this world? Holly couldn't imagine ever being permitted to live once they realized she could change the whole fabric of existence. Fabric. Holly suddenly realized she still had her invisibility cloak with her, and the key. She sat slowly up and looked around. Neither was much use to her here. There were no doors or windows visible. In fact, it suddenly occurred to Holly that this room was different from the one at the station. Yes, the room was still a small cubicle, and the walls were blood red with a huge, nearly 2-meter-high V painted on each side. But there had been a door before, hadn't there? And a torch. Holly distinctly remembered a smoky torch in the ceiling that made her want to cough. This room contained a single small candle, hanging suspended from a holder in the center of a high ceiling. The flickering candlelight made the imposing black V's seem to sway back and forth like living snakes. Holly shivered. How had she gotten here? Where was she? Not knowing what else to do, Holly buried her head in her lap and tried to practice alchemy. At the very least, maybe it would help with her splitting headache.